Welcome, everyone, to Martial Opera's Oral History Project. I am Eugenia Forteza. I am a mezzo-soprano and one of the singers in this concert. And today I am interviewing American composer Kenneth Fuchs, whom I have the immense pleasure to work with in this project. Welcome, Ken. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. It's a pleasure to be with you and all of our friends.
I will start with a brief introduction of your extensive career,
Great.
and then I'll get on with some questions.
Okay.
So, um, Kenneth Fuchs is the first living American composer recorded by the virtuoso Sinfonia of London and its conductor, John Wilson. He has composed music for orchestra, band, voice, chorus, soloists, and various chamber ensembles. And Fuchs has recorded for Naxos 5 albums with the London Symphony Orchestra, conducted by JoAnn Falletta, and the last of which won the 2018 Grammy Award for Best Classical Compendium. Um, and these were all released by Naxos. And this last Grammy Award winning album includes the song cycle I'm performing from, and it is gorgeous. Um, Kenneth Fuchs also serves as professor of music composition at the University of Connecticut, and he received his Bachelor of Music degree in composition from the University of Miami and his Master of Music and Doctor of Musical Arts degrees in composition from the Juilliard School. That's just a little bit. You can check more information on Ken's website. There's very complete. I got so much information about your career and your artistry on your website. So I'm gonna start with the questions. To start, Ken, I would love if you could share with us a bit about your early background. Where did you grow up? When does music appear in your life? Who influenced you in your early days? And when does music, especially composition, become your life's mission?
I was born in northeastern New Jersey in Bergen County and lived there with my family until I was 10. And when I was 10, we relocated to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It was a beautiful tropical paradise at that time. Um, Very quiet and not overbuilt or overrun. It was just perfect. And I'm so glad that I could live there for a while. I still, as the Floridians say, I still have some sand between my toes. Um, but it was when we moved to Fort Lauderdale that music really became very important in my life. About 10 years old, I joined the church choir and then sang in all the choruses in elementary school and middle school and high school. And vocal music actually was my first connection to music. And I studied voice for many years, had wonderful teachers. I was a lyric baritone. Flute and piccolo were my principal instruments, and I also studied piano. But my first connection to vocal music, that was significant because for me today, I still think that composition, all composition for any instrument, whether it's a wind instrument or a brass instrument or a string instrument, or even a percussion, I always feel like composition is a vocal utterance. And I think of it that way when I'm composing. It's such a natural expression to me to think about music and music composition in a vocal way. It's like speaking to your audience. So I was in choir and started studying voice, and my first musical inspirations came from the American Popular Songbook. My mother bought me many original cast albums of the classic Broadway musicals, and I really fell in love with the cornerstone composers of the American Popular Songbook. That includes Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, Richard Rodgers, Cole Porter, and then Harold Arlen and Julie Stein and Stephen Sondheim and Leonard Bernstein. They were my musical heroes, and to be honest, to this day, they still are in many ways. And I also include Aaron Copland and some of the American symphonists that I studied with eventually at Juilliard. My principal teacher was Vincent Persichetti, a very celebrated American symphonist. I also studied with David Diamond. But the point is that all of that music, the American Symphonic School, certainly Copland, certainly Bernstein, right, all grows out of the American Popular Songbook. And it was an easy connection for me to begin to understand American symphonic music, because a lot of those composers themselves were influenced by the American Popular Songbook and vocal music.
Yes. Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much for that answer. Um, so there's a phrase on your statement on your website, and I quote, that says, "My music communicates emotions with clearly articulated gestures that can be understood on first hearing." And I absolutely agree with the statement. It was when I was listening on my first listen of Poems of Life, this is how I felt immediately. I was like, oh, I understand this music. This music speaks to me. And also with what you just said, I could feel it in my throat right away. So has this always been your goal, to compose this vocal music that is approachable to both the performer and the audience? And, was that direction always clear from the start, or is it something that developed with time?
Well, I think it was the initial connection to those fantastic American songbook composers, the gorgeous melodies and expressive harmonies. And that was reinforced by my first composition teacher, Alfred Reed, at the University of Miami. That's where I got my undergraduate degree in composition. And I learned from Alfred how important the composer's connection with the audience is. And yes, to this day, no matter what work I'm writing, whether it's a string quartet or poems of life or large scale orchestral work, it's important to me that the listeners can understand the music on the first hearing. And by that, I mean, I don't necessarily mean that the music has to be pretty, or that I write down or write watered down music so people can appreciate it on the first hearing. But I think it is an artist's, one of the most important things that an artist can do is that, and that is to communicate with their audiences, their listeners. And very often, the people who hear my works for the first time are not educated musicians. They're music lovers. They like to go to symphony orchestra or vocal recitals or opera, but they're not trained musicians. So I'm always aware of that when I'm composing. I always put myself in the audience's seat on the other side of the footlights, because I feel it's my responsibility to gauge the work when I'm writing it, so that the audience can at least follow the gestures, hopefully hum a tune, but to understand what the piece is saying to them when they hear it for the first time. That doesn't mean it's not going to take a few listenings if it's a large scale orchestral work or string quartet, a composition without words. For them to understand it. It may take a couple of listenings, but the point is to make it understandable, as we're having a conversation right now. And I think that's what musical composition is. And writing for a symphony orchestra is a large scale conversation for 75 players, just as a string quartet is a conversation for 4 players. I often say to my students at UConn, imagine you're at the dinner table with your mother and your father and your brother and sister, and you're having a conversation. That's what writing music is about. Sometimes, someone makes a statement, you comment on it, you discuss it. Sometimes everybody talks all at once. But that's what composition is. So when it comes to setting words to music, it's a little easier because the composition is always then about the words. Otherwise, why would you set the words to music? For me, vocal music is about paying attention to what the author's vision is or message is in the prose or poetry. And I've set, at this point, miles of prose and poetry. I love writing vocal music, but having the words, I think, is in addition helpful to the audience to understand what the piece is about.
Mm, mm, yes. Um, so to connect with that response, at what point do you start composing vocal music, and how do you approach a commission or a premiere that's attached to a specific singer? And as a second question,
Yeah.
any interest on writing, composing a full opera aside from you have the song cycles, you've done the musicals, the monodrama. Of course, I'm curious as a singer. What's next?
Well, I'm going to say, I'll answer your second question first. Yes, I very much want to write a full-scale opera, and I'm reaching out to several opera companies. It's a challenge for composers to get a full-scale opera commission because, of course, the work itself is so complicated and it involves so many people, from the artistic administration of the opera company to the conductor and the singers and the production. I don't have to explain that to
Yeah.
you. I'm sure I don't have to explain that to our audience, but yes. And I have two properties that I'm really interested in. The first is the wonderful, beautiful novel by the British novelist James Hilton, and his novel Lost Horizon fascinates me. It is the story of Shangri-La, of a group of people being forced, actually, against their will, to arrive in Shangri-La, where the citizens there live in peace and harmony, secluded in the Himalayas to very old age. But as we discover, for some people, Shangri-La is a fantasy world. For others, it's a prison. And the opera, the story is really about people who choose to give up the mystical qualities of Shangri-La and return to our troubled world. I love this topic, and I really think I could do a very powerful large-scale opera on that novel. And it was also a very famous movie, first in 1937, directed by Frank Capra. There was a Broadway musical version of it in 1956, and then, of course, Burt Bacharach and Hal David did a film musical version of it in 1973. The other property is a fabulous film by the British director Nicholas Roeg called Don't Look Now. And it is about a troubled couple, the husband of which is clairvoyant. And the couple travel to very dark, cold, gritty, gray Venice in wintertime to mourn the sudden death of their young daughter. And they encounter another clairvoyant. And we actually learn throughout the story, the film, which starred Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, that he is actually envisioning his own death in Venice. It's a fascinating story, and you think you go to Venice, at how fabulous it is to go on gondolas, and it's sun-stroked water, but it's a very different underside of Venice. I love this story. It'd make a fabulous chamber opera, about 90 minutes for a small orchestra. So those are the operatic
Fabulous.
ways. Yeah, but there are several writers whose words inspire me. I've done a large-scale vocal chamber work called Movie House, based on 7 poems of John Updike, celebrated American novelist. I love his work. I've set quite a bit of Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and my large scale Shana for baritone voice and orchestra, Falling Man, is a post 9/11 work based on the novel of the same name by Don DeLillo, another celebrated American novelist. And case in point, Falling Man, as you can imagine, is a very disturbing topic, certainly, and the world that Don DeLillo takes us into in his conceptualization of what happened on the morning of September 11th is chilling, disturbing. The music is not always beautiful. I hope we arrive at a sense of comprehension, of understanding, if not resolution. So, you know, again, music doesn't always have to be beautiful, but it has to be understandable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yes, thank you. And I had asked also, I know we started talking about a lot of things. How if how do you approach working with a singer who's attached to a premiere or a commission?
Yes,
Um,
yes, absolutely. And to further answer the first part of your question, Poems of Life, the work that I'm so excited that you're learning, was commissioned by the American poet Judith Wolfe. And
mhm,
she asked that I create an orchestral song cycle based on her poetry for countertenor.
mhm,
And the countertenor she had in mind was David Daniels.
mhm,
So the piece, I selected the poems of Judy's that I wanted to set, and created a like a musical theater libretto out of the poems. And I confirmed my choices with Judy, and we discussed them. And as it turns out, my longtime friend, Juilliard classmate JoAnn Falletta, who, as you mentioned, has conducted all 5 of my recordings with the London Symphony Orchestra for Naxos. But her principal cellist at the Virginia Symphony, where she was music director for 25 years, was Michael Daniels, who is David Daniels' brother. So the idea for the work evolved where the countertenor is the principal in the work, obviously, but the solo obbligato cello is the counter presence to the singer, kind of a doppelganger
mhm,
to the singer, an instrumental doppelganger. And we were all very excited about this. So I worked on the piece, I wrote the work, and the premiere was set for April of 2017. And at the last moment, David Daniels was indisposed and could not sing the premiere.
mhm.
So a week before the premiere, when we found out that David couldn't do it, of course, the scramble and how are we going to find a countertenor who can learn this work in time for the premiere a week later. And Aryeh Nussbaum-Cohen had just won the Metropolitan Opera competition, major banner headline in the New York Times about his artistry. And that very day, we were able to secure Aryeh to sing the premiere, which
Wow.
he did beautifully. Perfect, a perfect moving performance. And then he went on to record the work for my 5th Naxos album, which won the Grammy Award for Best Classical Album.
Yeah, yeah, I love Arya's work. I remember seeing him in the semifinals
Oh,
um,
wow.
that year, and it, his presence really, like, it was electrifying. And since then, I've been really following his work. So I was so happy to see that it was him in the recording. I really love his singing.
Well, if, you know, when I start a vocal work, usually a singer is
Attached.
attached to it. And of course, I'm thinking about the singer. I'm writing the work especially for his or her vocal talents, and that was certainly the case with Falling Man, the British baritone Roderick Williams, fabulous singer. I've always loved his singing. So I
Mhm,
was thinking about Roddy throughout the composition of that piece. But, you know, I also wrote 3 chamber musicals with
mhm.
and playwright Lanford Wilson. And, you know, in the theater, that's a different process. I was imagining the characters in music through Lanford's librettos. But, you know, of course, the casting brought ideas to us after we saw
Yeah.
saw the auditions, and I know you know all about that. So it's a kind of it's a flexible.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, thank you so much for that answer. Um, well, I had my following question was about poems of life and this recording and this collaboration with your poet Judith Wolf, and also with the experience of winning a Grammy for this album. And you know, how do you get to there? How does it feel?
Well, I think most of us have played the lottery, so we know what it's like to win
Yes.
win against lottery odds. That's certainly what even getting a Grammy nomination is, not to mention going
Yeah.
the distance and actually winning. But I do want to say I am so excited that you're learning Poems of Life, because although I wrote it for countertenor, I was thinking about mezzo soprano at the same time. The range, the you know, the just the vocal range of the songs are basically in the mezzo soprano range, and I thought, well, you know, practically, it might be easier at some point to have more performances of the piece with mezzo sopranos than countertenors. But the thought of having a mezzo do the songs was never far from my mind when I was composing it. So I'm so thrilled that you're doing this, because this is going to be the first time actually that I hear the songs with mezzo soprano. So I'm very excited.
I'm thrilled as well because I mean, as you say, is the range is just it feels perfect, you know,
Well, and I've always favored the the alto layer
of the counter.
of of you know, I've written a concerto for English horn. I've written a concerto, or two concertos now, for alto saxophone. I've written a viola concerto, and I've always loved the warm sound of the mezzo soprano voice. It really speaks to me and inspires me. So, and as those instruments did for whom I wrote concerti. So it seems like a perfect fit. I really can't wait to hear
Me too.
you do the songs. Um, but you know, I'm in the middle of a Grammy campaign right now. My sixth orchestral album with the Sinfonia of London, my first with the Sinfonia of London, conducted by brilliant John Wilson. We've had a great rollout, 5-star reviews. Was chosen as an editor's choice for the October issue of Gramophone magazine. I'm so happy that the album has done so well. But we're right now, this week, next week, in the middle of the pending voting for on the first round ballot of the Grammy Awards, and that's when the voting members of the Recording Academy vote on all of the submissions in all of the categories and all of the fields, and that's, we're talking hundreds of different categories. Extremely competitive in you know, the classical categories that my album is eligible for. At this point, there could be 300, 350 submissions in each of those categories. And the first round ballot is important because the albums that receive the most votes are the ones that are moved on to the second ballot. And it's the second ballot that actually determines the 5 nominees in each category. So you're moving from 300 through voting to narrowing it down to 5. So it's very competitive, as lottery odds. I mean, there are lots of strategies and ways to develop a campaign, working with publicists, which I'm doing, and which I certainly did for my Grammy-winning album Spiritualist. But it's right now, it's like another full-time job dealing with the Grammy
I can
rollout.
imagine. Yeah.
But it was a thrill to win. JoAnn and I were seated next to each other. We couldn't believe it that we even got the nomination, but to sit in the hall, and when the host at the podium is announcing the nominees in that, I mean, my heart was pounding. Of course it
Yes.
was. And I remember JoAnn took my hand, and I just closed my eyes. And when I heard, and the Grammy goes to Spiritualist, I mean, it was like
outer body.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. We're very lucky, very blessed, and very grateful.
Yes. Well, fingers crossed for more. Yes. Oh, beautiful. I love hearing these kinds of stories.
It's fun to tell them.
Yes.
Nice to talk to you about it.
Oh, so continuing a little bit with Poems of Life, since
Mm,
it's what I will be presenting in this concert, um, the poems, the story, it spoke to me immediately, and I think it well to many people because it feels so relevant in a post-COVID world. All of these poems and the themes, very human themes that are touched on these poems.
yeah.
But obviously, this was composed before. So, do you think there was, or did you feel this kind of evergreen feeling as you were composing in these poems, and how human they are, and how clearly they speak to our human experience?
Judy, Judy's poetry is about the quotidian of life. I mean, how you experience life every day. And they're very clear, sometimes simple, and I don't mean simplistic, but very understandable about how we react to the world around us. And in this case, the the message of the cycle, the journey, the protagonist's journey,
Yeah.
is about losing the person you love most in your life and going through the stages of grief, letting go, understanding what grief is, the absolute pain of loss. And we hope eventually on the other side of it, at the end of the cycle, coming to some sense of acceptance. We have to.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's a very profound journey. I will share with you and our viewers. I'm very blessed. I haven't experienced the loss yet of the people who are closest to me. My mother is still alive. She's 90 years old and in good health. And my partner, my husband, Chris, and I have been together 43 years. But I still have those people close to me. But it was, a profound, it was a privilege to really think about this and how to deal with this musically and tell that story, that journey, express those emotions through Judy's words in my music.
Ugh, yes, I want to read just a few sentences from this last poem because it really I just selected this part that really moves me every time when I get to that point. Be with me in beauty, fulfillment, abundance, and utter peace. And I won't read what comes after because it's a spoiler. But
Well, the last line of that poem, which I can't wait for our viewers to hear you perform, is really the point of the whole piece.
mhm.
And it's such a profound statement that Judy makes. And I was privileged to have the opportunity to set those words.
Mm, yes, yes. I can't wait to share this with our audience. So we only have a few minutes left. I feel like I could just keep talking to you for all day.
Loving this. I wish we could just keep going.
Yes. But to start wrapping up, I know, as I mentioned in the introduction, you're a teacher, and I would like to, for this to be our closing question to leave things open, for you to share with us a little bit what is your philosophy in your teaching, and what advice might you have for young artists, young composers, young singer, emerging artists who are, you know, getting started out there with all your experience? What could you share with us?
Well, I have been so blessed my entire life to have wonderful teachers and several crucially important mentors along the way who supported me unconditionally because they recognized that I had talent to be a composer. And I'm talking about first my high school band director, Bentley Schellhammer, who when I told him I wanted to write music for our band, he encouraged me. And the most important thing he said was, and I will play everything you write. And he did. And that is how I learned at a very young age in high school, as a junior and senior in high school, to conceptualize large works for Symphonic Winds. And it's a little more difficult to write for winds, for Symphonic Winds with no strings in the ensemble. So I'm glad I tackled that challenge first. And then my composition teacher, my first composition teacher at the University of Miami, Alfred Reed, was a really truly celebrated composer for wind ensemble and band. So I learned so many things from Alfred that we spoke about before, but my composition teachers at Juilliard, Vincent Persichetti, a few other people there at the school, fantastic teachers, and composers, professional composers whose music I admired, who thought it was a good idea to support me. And I'm talking about friends like Stephen Sondheim, who I met when I moved to New York in 1979 to pursue grad studies at Juilliard, master's and doctorate. And Ned Rorem, one of our most celebrated vocal composers, was a very dear friend. He lived just around the corner from me on West 70th Street. And William Schumann, celebrated American symphonist, president of Juilliard, the first president of Lincoln Center. So these are the people who supported me and encouraged me, wrote letters of recommendation, and told me to keep going, along with the great abstract expressionist artist Helen Frankenthaler, whose paintings have inspired so many of my works. So I learned from those experiences that the real greats were never too big to lend a helping hand. And so I believe that it's my responsibility to pass that on to my own students and encourage them. And we often say to them, music is hard. There is nothing easy about a life as a professional musician. It's very challenging. You have to keep working, you have to keep improving, you have to make contacts, you have to find performances and recordings and publications. But, from the very beginning, I always felt that I had something important to say as a composer. I felt this with my first works in high school, and not to sound too self-interested, but I believed in what I had to say, and I still believe in what I have to say as a composer. And I think that just that basic belief in yourself, really when the chips are down, for singers, for instrumentalists, for composers, anyone who wants a professional career as a performing musician, you have to have a lot of self-confidence and believe in yourself. And that's what I want to try and pass on to my students through the teaching that I do.
Oh, thank you so much. I could not agree more. Is that faith in oneself, and that's that spiritual aspect of
Right.
what we do, right? Of art, and that
Right.
keeps you going. Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Ken, it's been a pleasure.
It's,
We are all rooting for your Grammy campaign. We'll keep an eye on it. Thank you so much for your time. I am inviting everyone who watches this video to join us on October 28th at the Cell Theater for our Oral History Project concert. It will be fabulous.
my thanks to you, and also to the wonderful Jim Schaefer, whose vision it is to create martial opera. We're so lucky to be part of this family.
We
So,
really are. Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for bringing us together.
exactly.
And thank you, Ken. I'll talk to
Big
you
hug. All right.
soon. Hugs. Bye. Thank you, everyone.